Today is the big day. We will finish up our Curvaceous E-Z-V-T and you will have one of these looks. In the last video, we knitted up to the indicated point. In this one, we'll begin with a little bit of straight knitting up to the neckline division. Then we will divide the work and knit the halves of the neckline separately. We'll be working from the dotted line up and complete the sleeves and the neckline in the same operation and finish them before we bind off. Both the sleeve hems and the neck edges are finished with a single column of tucked purl stitches. So before we bind off, we will be dropping a stitch, laddering it down to a certain point, and then latching it back up. There are 3 ways of finding the correct spot to work down to, and you need to decide now. Here's the first one. Create an eyelet on the 3rd stitch in from each edge. If this is the method you want to use, do that right now for the sleeve, and in a minute or 2, you'll do the same at the neck edges. This is by far the easiest method for laddering down to such a given point, and the stitches can't run past it, but it is visible as an eyelet on the finished garment. To create it, move stitch 3 to either needle 2 or 4 from the edge. Keep 3 in work. Make sure the latch is open on bonds and knit smarts, and just keep on knitting, and it will resume knitting stitches and behaving normally. The second option is to take a piece of yarn about 6 inches long, fold it, and hang the fold on the 3rd needle from each edge now to mark the sleeve position. And when we get ready to divide the neckline, we will mark the 3rd needle from each neck edge in the same manner. To work the neckline, we'll be placing half of the needles in hold. So the marked needle is the one that would be marked with the yarn marker. When you hang a spare piece of yarn in the needle, it gets caught in the fabric, but it's not integral to the fabric. So it stays to give you information later, but then you can easily pull it out with your fingertips without harming the fabric at all. The third option is the one I actually used, and I do not recommend it for beginners. This isn't because it's difficult, it's only because you feel less confident as a beginner in spotting the correct spot to go to. For the sleeves, I laddered down to the point at which I had added in the stitch during the increases. That's stitch number 3 from the edge, of course. We're talking about the sleeve hems here. And it appears as a loop connected to nothing. Pick up that loop and begin to work your trim, the tucked purl column. And we will get to that later with specific instructions. And at the neckline, just ladder down to the row at which the work was divided. Find it by eye and begin latching up. It's the finding it by eye that takes a little bit of knitting experience before you're going to feel confident, but this is the fastest way. Okay, with that decision made and your spots marked or not marked, we can keep on knitting. Knitting the blouse length 27-inch version, your row counter should now read 85. For this version, knit straight until row 100 is complete. For the tunic length 32-inch version, the row count begins at 105, and we knit straight until row 120 is complete. We are now up to this point, the bottom of the V, and it's time to divide the work. We're going to knit one side of the neckline first. It's going to be the right side. So in order to illustrate that, I have the needles on the left pulled out to hold. But in reality, you don't want them out to hold yet, because the very next step is to take the 2 center stitches from the entire piece of knitting and cross them, replacing them on the opposite needles from which they started. This is not an absolutely essential step, but it does make the bottom of the V neater. And now put all the needles on the side away from the carriage and hold, and we'll work on the others. For the blouse length version, knit until row 136 is complete. For the tunic length version, knit until row 160 is complete. Since the needles are being held on the left, the knitting gets longer and longer on the right only, and you will need to move claw weights up the slit as it develops to keep them knitting off nicely. When the correct row count is reached on one side, place the needles that just finished knitting into hold, snip the yarn, leaving a good long yarn tail because it can be used to bind off. Return the presently held needles to work, putting them into upper working position. Readjust your weight so that that side of the knitting will have proper weight as we move over and begin to work on it. Set your row counter back to the point at which the neckline began on the other side, either 100 or 120 depending on the version. And you can either start the carriage on the opposite side or do what I'm doing here, move to the center and then thread it so it can start to knit. Knit straight until the row counter again reads either 136 or 160 depending on the version. Now here's what we have, and all we have to do is drop the third stitch from each end. On the neckline, we drop down either to a row that you marked with an eyelet or with a yarn marker, or just find the first row after the split by eye and begin latching up. Insert the latch tool through the last stitch in the column that's going to remain as it was. Slide the tool behind 2 rungs of the ladder and pull through the second one. Behind 2 rungs, grab 1, pull through. Behind 2, grab 1, pull through. It's the second one that we grab, but the tool must slide behind both before it can pull back and create a stitch. And what we're doing is creating a purl column of stitches reversed from the knit columns, which helps with stopping the rolling, but we're only pulling every other rung through. So this tends to prevent the neckline from drooping, as well as to help halt roll. It will seem awkward at first, but you can get very fast at it with a little bit of practice. Probably by the third column that one needs to do on this pattern, you'll be good at it. At the top of the column, hang the final stitch back on the original needle. Do the same thing on both edges and at the neckline. Don't forget to do both sides of the neckline. If you created eyelets, begin simply by pushing the tool behind 2 rungs and pulling the second one under the first. When all 4 areas have been laddered down and latched back up as tuck purls, bind off either around the gate pegs or using the transfer method. I'm not including the bind off in this video because I think all of you know how already, but should this be your first project, I do have videos on the subject to help you. Be sure to bind off the 2 shoulders separately. This represents the center point where we divided for the neckline. Here's one neck edge hanging down where we have bound off the right half of the stitches, and that's one shoulder finished. Now start binding off the second shoulder with the second piece of yarn. You can see we don't want the shoulders attached to one another. Your carriage might possibly be on the other side depending how you decided to work, but the point is the same. The front and back of this top are identical. So repeat everything you just did and make a second piece just like the first. Now sew both side seams from the hem all the way through the underarm increases. If you used the simple increase as I did, you can mattress stitch up to them and then whip stitch them to finish that underarm curve. Seam the front and back together at the shoulder, working behind the bind off. The finished neckline depth on the tunic version is a little bit deeper than on the blouse version. The blouse is basically done, but a cotton top is never done really until it's been washed and dried. So do that and wear your beautiful new top proudly.